Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen. FDA Office of Women's Health Chief Susan Wood shook the nation when she resigned in 2005 over her agency's refusal to approve the over-the-counter morning-after contraceptive Plan B. We'll revisit that story and its meaning in just a few minutes, but first, disposing of chemical warfare agents, VX, sarin, and the like. The 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention required their disposal by 2007, and for good reason. Mustard agent, infamously used by Germany in World War I, causes blistering, breathing problems, convulsions, blindness, and heart attack. Well, 2007 came and went, and now the U.S. Defense Department says 2017 is an optimistic date for being rid of the U.S. chemical warfare stock. Some environmentalists charge the government as keeping the public in the dark about how chemical warfare agents, including mustard agent contaminated with mercury, are being disposed. With us to talk about the campaign to dispose of chemical warfare agents is Dr. Paul Walker of Global Green USA, and joining him to explain a lawsuit in Oregon challenging the decision to incinerate mustard agent is Richard Condit of the Government Accountability Project. Welcome both of you to Whistle Where You Work. Paul, tell us a little bit about the state of the global chemical weapons stockpile.
Well, Mark, the bad news is, I guess, 6 countries have declared stockpiles of chemical weapons, and they're obliged to do that under the Chemical Weapons Convention, which most of the world has now signed since the mid to late 1990s. We have about 72,000 tons globally, and that's in probably 10 million different artillery shells and spray tanks and warheads and landmines. And all 6 countries, it's the United States, Russia, Libya, Albania, India, and South Korea, have all begun, and a couple of them have actually finished their destruction programs. But the 2 biggest possessor states are really the United States and Russia.
Do we have confidence that all of the states that actually possess chemical weapons are reporting that they have?
We don't. We don't. In fact, of the 184 signatories to the International Chemical Weapons Convention, as I say, 6 have declared chemical weapons, but there are still at least 11 countries, plus some other territories not recognized by the United Nations that are outside the treaty. And the ones we're most concerned about are mainly 4. North Korea, which we believe has a stockpile, Israel, which is likely to have a stockpile, Syria, and Egypt. And Egypt, we know in the past, has actually used chemical weapons on Yemeni citizens.
And what does the Chemical Weapons Convention mandate regarding the existence of chemical weapons stockpile?
The Chemical Weapons Convention, which was negotiated throughout the 1980s, it was a long, long, very technical treaty, mandates that no one can research, develop, produce, deploy, or use chemical weapons, period. In other words, it bans all chemical weapons, and it says that all possessor states, declared possessor states, must destroy their weapons by 2007, which of course is now gone by. Most countries have gotten 5-year extensions to that, and so now it says they must be gone 100% by 2012.
And are there particular methods of disposal that the convention requires?
The convention itself requires no particular disposal method, but the choice of technology or technologies has really been one of the major vexing questions of all countries. What's safest? What's most environmentally sound? The treaty does say it has to be done in full protection of public health and the environment, according to national standards, so that each country doing it, whether it's the Russians or the Americans or the Albanians or the South Koreans, have to do it, in fact, in full protection of public health and the environment. But the treaty itself and the implementing organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW in The Hague, leaves that really up to the national authorities to determine. The big fight over the years, we're now almost 20 years into active destruction of chemical weapons, has been basically different perceptions and understandings between high thermal processes, incineration of chemical weapons, which is the preferred method of the U.S. Army, versus more controllable processes, batch processes, which is mostly liquid chemistry or neutralization processes, much preferred in general by the environmental community.
And Richard Condit, you filed a lawsuit in Oregon challenging the method of disposal of mustard gas, not so much because of the mustard gas itself, but because you discovered that there was mercury that was being taken into the atmosphere by incineration. Is that right?
That's right, Mark. What's going on in Oregon, and it's also a problem in Utah where they're disposing there as well, is that there have been what they call ton containers, which are actually large storage containers of mustard agent, that have come up with amounts of mercury in them that are causing regulators and citizens great concern, because mercury is a very dangerous chemical, and as Paul points out, since the Army's preferred method is incineration for these materials, incineration, unless you find a way to capture the mercury through the incineration process, the mercury essentially escapes into the atmosphere and then is deposited in water and soil and so forth.
And what are the dangers associated with mercury?
Well, mercury is a neurotoxicant, which means that it has very serious effects on the nervous system and brain function, that sort of thing. And in particular, a form of mercury known as methylmercury is the culprit that is of most concern. And methylmercury is usually created once mercury is deposited, and organisms have an opportunity to break down the original mercury, creates the methyl form, and then you have the problem of that mercury moving its way through the environment.
Has there been a risk assessment conducted to see what the impact of incineration versus liquid neutralization would be in the disposal of this mustard agent?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There's been a lot of risk assessment work done around the various U.S. stockpile locations. The problem has been that there have really been no serious comparative risk assessments done, which is what many citizen groups wanted. In other words, to compare what the risks would be in a reasonable process associated with incineration versus neutralization versus perhaps other types of technologies, such as a fairly new one on the scene, which is called controlled detonation. To do those comparisons, the Army would have to put incineration up against these other technologies and see how it fared, and there seems to be great resistance to doing that.
And Paul, when you look around the world, is there any preference that you see personally? I know that your organization doesn't take a position on this, but you mentioned before that environmentalists prefer neutralization to incineration. Do you see any particular reason why neutralization should be preferred in a situation like this?
Well, the environmental community, of which we're part, we're very strong environmentalists and have been for years under Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, and are in over 30 countries today. In the environmental community, ourselves included, really prefer systems whereby when you deal with toxic waste of some type, whether it's medical waste, whether it's garbage, or in fact, in this case, some of the most deadly, waste on Earth, basically chemical weapons, nerve agents, that you're able to control all the effluents, whether it's gaseous, liquid, or solid waste. And by controlling it means that once you burn it or neutralize it or whatever you treat it with, you can actually then contain the waste, measure it, see how toxic it is, whether there is, for example, mercury inside the waste, and then you can, if it needs more treatment, put it back through the system again. The challenge with incineration is that most of its waste in volume is gaseous waste that goes up the smokestack. So it pumps out thousands of tons of gaseous waste a day, no matter what you're burning. And that's why incineration has become such a red flag in the environmental community, because no one really knows what pollutants, persistent organic pollutants, NOx and SOx and other effluents are really coming out the stack. And we know in the case of chemical weapons incineration in the United States from, it's 18 years of experience now, that in fact it even pumps out every now and again what we say burps out a live agent. And of course you absolutely don't want live agent coming out the stack, because that kills in a matter of minutes, perhaps even seconds, if it hits anybody.
But one of the concerns here also is the being out of compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention in terms of time.
Right.
Incineration can be conducted more quickly, couldn't it, than neutralization? And therefore,
Well,
at least the chemical agent would be removed more quickly through incineration than through neutralization.
right. I mean, there is always a trade-off between time and schedule versus cost versus public health and environmental protection versus legal responsibilities under the International Chemical Weapons Convention Treaty, because the Army has much preferred incineration as kind of a quick if dirty, somewhat dirty technology for the last 2 decades, along with the National Research Council. They've moved forward in sort of silver bullet fashion, thinking they could build it. The bumper sticker with the Army is build it, burn it, forget it. And yet with the environmental community, issues that Richard and I and many others have raised in the United States, in Russia, and other places, is that it's incumbent on them to do it right. Protect the environment, protect public health. And as the Director General of the OPCW in The Hague, the guy who's burdened with enforcing all the treaty requirements, says, listen, we're destroying chemical weapons to make the world safer and more peaceful. And it would be absolutely self-contradictory if, in doing it, we killed people or badly injured people doing it. So I think...
Well, how much of this is really a price issue, a cost issue? The Army built the incinerator in order to deal with these chemical agents, and it wasn't just mustard, it was the X and sarin also, and they were disposed of without a problem, right, through incineration. It really is when we deal with the mustard and we have the problem of the mercury contamination that we run into a problem with incineration, and that would require essentially the Army to say that our toy is no longer working, right?
The fact is that incineration has been a problem in a number of respects. The campaigns dealing with sarin and VX, although complete, were not without their problems. And the issue with incineration, as Paul points out, is we have so high volume of material coming out the stack that is not really properly measured or monitored, that there is really no way of knowing exactly how much has been deposited out there. So that is a huge problem. But to get to your question, the issue of it's already been built, and therefore the economy lends itself to continuing with that process. I think Paul's point is well taken, and the environmental standards are well taken, which is that if you come across an opportunity to change direction in a I guess more safe manner, more environmentally sound manner, it really is incumbent upon the government to do so in the United States or elsewhere, and that's what the citizens in Oregon are trying to get their state government and the Army to do, is change tracks and get this thing done in the right way.
And so what are the next steps in the incineration of mustard gas in Oregon?
Well, right now they're planning to go ahead with incineration. Oregon is unique, though, in that unlike any other state in the nation that I'm aware of, it requires that the regulators approve a technology that is considered the best available technology. And so the process that we've been putting them through informally prior to getting to the lawsuit stage was to declare and to articulate how they were demonstrating that the technology they were choosing, in this case incineration, was the best. And there are numerous flaws in how they've done that, and the problem is that they haven't really been able to do that comparison of risks and so forth that I've said would be a very open way of communicating what the best technology is. And so we're left with a situation where the citizens have no confidence on this stage of the campaign what is going to happen and what environmental impact it will have. And it's particularly important in Oregon because probably around 65–67% of their stockpile is mustard agent in ton containers. Now, all of those ton containers are not deemed contaminated with mercury, but that is the largest part of their stockpile, and so this is the biggest part of the job that they would like to have done right.
But the point I would add too, Mark, is that we know mustard neutralizes very well with hot water. It's a very simple process, and the Army years ago in the 1990s proposed burning the complete stockpile, whether it's lewisite or mustard or phosgene or any of the nerve agents. And the French for years have used just simple steam treatment and hot water. You pour it in and mix it. I've seen it in a lab. It just sort of disappears. It's kind of magical. But it's a very simple process and very safe. And so that's why the environmental community for years has said they'd rather have everything neutralized so it can be controlled, and we know what's in the toxic waste and we know how to dispose of it properly then. But in this particular case in Oregon, it's such an enormous, we're talking hundreds, I don't know, maybe even thousands of tons of mustard there. Mixing it with hot water, stirring it around for a few minutes, shaking it up, like a cocktail.
Have it for dinner.
And you're done, more or less. You have to go through a second stage treatment, bioremediation or something, to eliminate the precursor chemicals, but much, much simpler. So in this case, I think the Army is just marching forward with their silver bullet, what they know best, as I say, burn it and forget it.
We'll continue to monitor compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Oregon lawsuit challenging the incineration of mercury-contaminated mustard gas. Many thanks to Paul Walker and Richard Condit for joining us. When we return, Susan Wood says the FDA never had a Plan B for the Plan B morning after pill. Welcome back to Whistle Where You Work. The incoming Obama administration promises many changes in Washington, among them taking politics and theology out of government science, a practice that critics charge has permeated the Bush years. A case in point is the story of then FDA Assistant Commissioner Susan Wood and Plan B. A morning after contraceptive, Plan B passed every scientific hurdle at the FDA, but for years was held captive by the Commissioner's office, leading to Wood's dramatic resignation in 2005. Today, Susan Wood is on the faculty of the George Washington University School of Public Health and Health Services. Welcome, Susan, to Whistle Where You Work.
Thank you very much.
Susan, talk about your educational and professional background before you came to the FDA.
Well, that's sort of a long and zigzagged path. I'm trained as a cell biologist, very basic biologist, lab person. Got my PhD in biology from Boston University, doing work in Woods Hole, Massachusetts at the Marine Biological Laboratories. But I took a fellowship sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Biophysical Society to work on Capitol Hill. This is a really good idea to get scientists working on policy in the setting where policy and politics happen. Capitol Hill, Washington, and AAAS and others have done that. And I did that in 1990, went on to Capitol Hill, newly exposed to what's happening, but bringing my experience with biomedical research to Capitol Hill. And I worked for the Women's Caucus and worked on women's health policy for a number of years when issues such as inclusion of women in clinical trials, expanding research on breast cancer, osteoporosis, heart disease, AIDS, the whole host of things that were so important. And we made a lot of progress in those years. I then went on in the late 90s and worked at the Department of Health and Human Services. By then there had been an expansion of focus on women's health at the Department of Health and Human Services, at CDC, at the National Institutes of Health, and at the FDA. But I took a job at HHS, working in the Office of the Secretary, Office on Women's Health there, and I worked there for a number of years on a range of issues, again, trying to work in developing new models of healthcare that worked for women, working on developing educational campaigns, and again, continuing the work that we had started in the 1990s.
And you came to FDA in 2000. And when did you become the director of the Office of Women's Health?
In 2000, I took the position as head of women's health at FDA. And that was, again, a great opportunity to work in women's health very closely at the area where new products are approved, not as a reviewer, not as a scientific or medical expert who makes decisions on new products, but trying to make sure that FDA was implementing these policies of making sure women's health needs were addressed in the work that they do at FDA.
Now, the drug that became so controversial, this Plan B, was actually approved in 1999 as a prescription drug. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's based on the method that's been known for as long as the birth control pill has been around, which is that a high dose of regular birth control pills, if taken immediately after unprotected sex, will prevent or has a chance of preventing unintended pregnancy. And that was just, we now have a product, Plan B, came on the market as that was specifically designed. Take one now, take one in a few hours, and could be advertised and marketed that. And
so how is it different than RU46, the so-called abortion pill?
Well, it's actually completely different. In fact, they're opposite products. Plan B is high-dose progestin birth control pills. RU46 and works by preventing pregnancy. RU46 is an anti-progestin, and it actually works by terminating an early pregnancy. It does, in fact, cause an early abortion. So they're very, very different, and it's very important to get that information out.
Now, in 2003, Barr Laboratories, the maker of Plan B, went back to the FDA and said, we'd like to sell it over the counter, no prescription necessary. What happened?
Well, it should have been a fairly routine approval. This is a product which has a very good safety profile. It clearly works better when taken quickly. Sooner is better, and so having it available over the counter without a prescription really helps improve how well it can work, and therefore gives a chance to help women when they need this type of product. However, it was not a routine approval. It should have been approved in 6 months. Instead,
now, it was approved by the FDA Advisory Committee, however, right?
Yes, the Advisory Committee supported it. All of the FDA staff internally, up to a certain level in the hierarchy, supported its approval. And it was only sort of the leadership and whatever happened beyond that blocked it. But it ultimately took 3 commissioners, 3 years.
Well, what was happening in your office during this time as it was sitting before the commissioners?
Well, frankly, it should never have been before the commissioners. It should have been decided in a routine manner because there was really nothing controversial about its approval. But what we were doing in my office was keeping an eye on it. We were not the reviewers. There's plenty of expertise inside FDA in the reproductive health division and in the over-the-counter drug division who were handling the technical and medical reviews and making their recommendations in the normal fashion. But we knew it was going to be at least somewhat high profile, and therefore everyone was making sure that it was being done exactly correctly, and we were sort of kept informed and in the loop. But what we didn't know, and what I didn't know as we got to the point when I resigned, was whether or not, how could it be stopped? Why would it ever be blocked? Because there really was never a good rationale.
Now, the initial rationale for keeping it off the OTC market was that it hadn't really been tested on teens under 16 and under. So Barr Labs came back and applied again, right?
Right. They came back. Well, I want to clarify. It wasn't that it wasn't tested. It's perfectly safe and effective in all females of childbearing potential. This, just like birth control pills, if you're an age that can use them and effectively, it's safe and effective for all ages. The question was, and it was an artificial excuse because it had no good rationale, was that they hadn't had enough very young people in the studies on could they read the label and understand it and use it correctly in terms of taking that one pill now and one pill later. So it was sort of a very superficial rationale.
But Barr Laboratories tried to accommodate that, right?
They did. They said, okay, if you're going to have an age cutoff, we will come back and apply again for the 16 and overs to be over the counter, and prescription, keeping it prescription for those under 16. That differentiation of age was what was then used later as the rationale for delaying it still further. Ultimately, they came back another year later, and this is what led to my resignation, and said, well, this idea of keeping it prescription for one group and non-prescription for another is in fact so novel and complex, we're going to have to go into federal rulemaking and throw it and so forth.
Before that happened, this came before the Senate. And a number of senators attempted to put on hold the permanent appointment of Lester Crawford as commissioner until he promised, and HHS promised, to render a determination about this. Did they do that?
Well, that was during the spring, summer, and fall, late summer of 2005, and that was ultimately when they came up with this this idea of throwing it into rulemaking was what Dr. Crawford announced at the end of August that year. And Senators Murray and Clinton had blocked Crawford's nomination. He had made this promise that he would come up with an answer by September 1 of 2005. And at the end of August, he made this announcement that this complex thing that FDA had asked for in terms of prescription and non-prescription status was so complex we'd have to delay it yet again for another unspecified period of time while we went through the federal rulemaking process. That was actually the trigger for me to resign, because at that point the age had shifted again to 17. We could live with that, but the question before the agency at that stage was, can we allow a safe, effective contraception that can help prevent an unintended pregnancy and prevent the need for an abortion? Can we allow essentially adult women to have access to this? Because we'd already done that age cutoff thing and essentially said we're not going to address the issues of whether younger teens should use it. But for women 17 and older, can we let this safe, effective contraception on the market as an over-the-counter drug? That was the simple question before the agency. And something about that was so disturbing to somebody that it had to be blocked for an unknown period of time.
Why did you choose to resign over that?
Well, for several reasons. One is, as a federal employee and a good FDAer, which I was, I'm very loyal to the agency. They had really turned the agency's review process on its head. They were not letting the scientists and the medical experts make a determination on a very safe and effective product and make the decision based on FDA criteria and FDA standards based on science and medicine. And it was merely to prevent adult women from access to contraception. Secondly, I was head of women's health, and so I was either going to have to stand by this decision that FDA had made, and the FDA leadership had made, and say, either say nothing or say it was, a bit of a roadblock, but we would get past it and so forth. And at that point, that was just not credible. And so my own personal scientific credibility, I felt, was at stake, since I was, at least nominally, the face of women's health at the agency. And finally, it's just not a good decision for women's health. This is a product that can help women. It's not a magic bullet. It is not, the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it is a product that women should have access to when they need it. It really was just unacceptable on all of those counts. And so I felt it was just personally better for me just to step aside.
Well, many thanks to Susan Wood for telling the story of the FDA and Plan B, and for her act of conscience in resigning from the FDA in order to tell it. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Whistle Where You Work.